Hey everyone, welcome to our next video for chapter 9. So I'm changing the order a little bit just because I think it makes more sense. So we've just recently learned about allele frequencies and how alleles can change through mutation. Now what we're going to do is we're going to learn about how our allele frequencies can change between populations. So we're going to be looking at 9C and 9E today. So we're going to be looking at genetic drift and gene flow and how allele frequencies can change due to these two factors. And we're also going to be looking at selective breeding and how that can change allele frequencies as well. And overall, we're going to be looking at how this can impact genetic diversity of populations. So what is genetic drift? So genetic drift refers to changes in a population's allele frequency due to sudden and random occurrences. So the most important thing to remember about genetic drift is that it is random. So it is like random events like weather events, things like that, that is genetic drift. So this can impact genetic diversity. So depending on how the allele frequencies have been changed, this can severely impact the diversity of that population. And there's two different ways that genetic drift can occur, which we'll go through now. So the first one we have is the bottleneck effect. So this is when a large portion of a population is wiped out by a random event, such as a natural disaster. So for instance, here we have a population of beetles, and there's quite a bit of diversity there. We've got some green beetles, some red beetles, and some blue beetles, some yellow beetles. So we've got quite a good diversity of alleles in this population. A random event such as a natural disaster can wipe out a significant proportion of that population. That's why we call it the bottleneck effect. So you can see here in that natural disaster, only a handful of our beetles survived. So you can see that only yellow and green beetles have survived, whereas in the original population, we had blue beetles, red beetles. I think I can see a black beetle in there as well. So in the natural disaster, just by randomness and chance, only our yellow and our green beetles have survived. So this has dramatically decreased the population size and therefore dramatically impacted the allele frequencies. So whereas before we had lots of variety of alleles, we now only have two different alleles in this beetle population. And therefore we've severely lowered the genetic diversity of this population. So you can see as these beetles, breed and go through generations and go about their lives, the new population here is only composed of the yellow and the green beetles. So in this scenario, we have lost genetic diversity. And most bottlenecks scenarios where there's a natural disaster or something like that, we're normally going to decrease genetic diversity. Typically, if we're reducing the population size, there's going to be a decrease of genetic diversity as well. We also have something called the founder effect that can cause genetic drift. So this is when a small unrepresentative sample of individuals separates from the larger population and colonizes a new region. So this could be due to something like, very hard to think of on the spot, like a river, for instance, separates a colony of beetles. So let's say we've got this beautiful colony of beetles. Again, you can see that there's blue alleles, yellow alleles, red alleles, green alleles, a large diversity of alleles in this population. And then all of a sudden, for whatever reason, a big river forms right in the middle of where their beetle population lives. This means that the original population stays on one side of the river and the other population has been separated and has now gone to colonize this new area. So if we had all green beetles, for instance, just by chance, because remember these are completely random, let's say all the green beetles happen to be on this side of the river and therefore on the new population, it no longer mirrors the original gene pool of the original population. So we now only have green alleles in this population, which means we have much lower genetic diversity in the new population. And then you can see in future generations, we now only have a population of green beetles. So the founder effect is when individuals are separated due to a random event of some description, and this normally again lowers the population size and therefore decreases genetic diversity of the new population. So, like I said, the effect of genetic drift on diversity is normally negative. So it normally reduces genetic diversity in a population due to the random removal of alleles. So it's the random removal. It reduces genetic diversity because of smaller populations as well. So normally these events reduce the population size, and that just kind of naturally reduces the diversity of alleles as well. So this reduction in genetic diversity increases the risk of inbreeding, which is, keeping, those same alleles in the population, lower adaptive potential as well. So for instance, if there is a particular changing condition and the blue beetles are not very fit to survive that condition, their population is much more likely to die out than a more genetically diverse population. So genetic drift normally decreases genetic diversity and population size as well. We then have something called gene flow. So gene flow is not random, but it's still the change of allele frequencies. But this time it's a change in allele frequencies by introducing or removing alleles between populations through a couple of different mechanisms here. So we can have migration. So migration is when there's two populations that become close together. So for instance, one beetle population has migrated to the same spot as another beetle population. This might be due to, forest clearing or some other geographical barrier. And because both of these beetle populations are now in the same spot, they can introduce, their own alleles between each other and change the allele frequencies in both of their populations. So migration is one. So we have obviously immigration, which is the addition of alleles, and emigration, which is the removal of alleles. So in this scenario, this would be immigration of both species. But let's say that, one of those species then decided to leave again. That would be emigration, and then those alleles would then be removed from the population. We also then have interbreeding. So this is when individuals temporarily enter a population to breed, which changes the gene pool. So let's say that we, have this population of red beetles that have been living on this island for a long time. Then all of a sudden, a blue beetle, just on his travels, finds his population and interbreeds with some of the other beetles there. This is then going to introduce that blue allele into the population, and which is going to change the gene pool of that original red beetle population. So gene flow can also affect allele frequencies by either migration or interbreeding. So this can, depending on whether they're being added or removed, this can either increase or decrease genetic diversity depending on the scenario. So in this scenario, for instance, this blue beetle, migrating over to this red population and interbreeding there, that could increase genetic diversity in that population because now we have more variety of alleles. But let's say that that blue beetle was leaving this population and removing alleles from that red population, that might decrease genetic diversity because we would be left again with just red alleles. So it depends on which direction this is going in. We're also going to talk about selective breeding in this video because this again is a change of allelic frequencies. The only difference is that it's not happening naturally, it's happening due to human intervention. So what selective breeding is that's when humans can decide what traits they think are desirable in plants and animals, for instance, and those desirable traits we can manipulate into the population through breeding processes. So selective breeding is similar to natural selection, but of course, instead of it being natural, the difference is that the selection pressure is unnatural. So it's human intervention that is causing these populations to have specific alleles. So for instance, in this example here with the sheep, we've got variation in the sheep population. So naturally we have lots of different alleles. So there's one for really fluffy sheep and then, not so fluffy sheep. Then a farmer comes along and he decides that that high density wool, that fluffy sheep is really favorable because we can get more wool every time we shear them and we can make more money. So what the farmer then does is it only breeds those high density wool sheep. And then in the population that results, we have all high wool density sheep. So selective breeding actually normally decreases genetic diversity because we're normally choosing one trait that we like and pretty much getting rid of all the rest. So selective breeding actually decreases diversity. So if we have poor breeding practices, which often we do, selective breeding can cause human-induced bottleneck. So if we have a large population and there's only a very small percentage that have a desired trait that we like, that means that we will be increasing the allele, the frequency of that one allele, but then decreasing the genetic diversity of the rest of the population. So for instance, if we are like, we really just want these dark coloured beetles for a research that we are, undertaking. So we start to breed only dark beetles, and then eventually it'll be all dark beetles. So this has severely reduced the genetic diversity of this beetle population, which is detrimental to survival. Because let's say that something comes and this dark beetle is not, suitable to survive that selection pressure. Therefore, the whole beetle population is going to be wiped out. Whereas in the original population, because there was so much variability, this beetle population was much more likely to survive a change in the environment. So selective breeding is actually quite detrimental to survival because populations don't have the diversity to survive variations in their environment. So hopefully this helps. Please come to class with any questions and I will see you there.